Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. John Elrick, PhD from UC Berkeley and visiting assistant professor at Vassar College in New York. He recently took a trip to support students in traveling across China. At Vassar, he teaches classes on cities, landscape planning, and housing justice. Welcome to the bridge. Hello, John Elrick.
Hi, Jason. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. So could you tell us about your first trip to China?
Wow. Yeah, I can tell you that it was a whirlwind of a trip. It was my first trip there, and I, like you said, went with a class, and it was incredible in a lot of ways. We got back a couple of weeks ago, so we were there for around 2 weeks on a trip organized for an intensive course at Vassar by a colleague, Yu Zhou, in the geography department at Vassar. We had about, 20 or so people all together on the trip. So we moved through the space as a group, and yeah, just so much to take in. It was a really fantastic experience. So,
well, could you tell us, where did you actually go? What were the names of a couple of the cities or townships that you visited?
Yeah, so we ended up flying into Wuhan.
Wow, cool.
And we spent a little bit of time there. The first couple of days, we were able to meet with students and professors at Central China Normal University, and so got the feel a little bit for Wuhan. And then we took a bus. We went to, and you'll have to pardon and excuse my horrible pronunciation here, but we went to Zhenjiang. The Xinjiang district, spent a couple of days there looking at different models of agricultural production, different kinds of social relations of rice and crayfish production there.
Wow.
Which was really interesting. And then we kept on moving. We ended up going to the Three Gorges Dam,
wow,
of course, which was incredible.
I've been here more than 10 years. I still haven't been, but I would love to go. So I'm jealous of you.
Yeah, it's definitely spectacular, to say the least. So that was really interesting. We also went to Enshi and visited some villages there, primarily looking at the kind of tourist economy. I mean, we were traveling as tourists and also looking at kind of the relationship or the developments in rural parts of that province. And we went to the Grand Canyon, of course, which was amazing. And then we ended up finally taking a train to Chongqing.
Wow, yeah.
What an incredible city. My goodness.
Yeah, what an incredible city.
Yeah, that was a highlight for sure. To be there for a couple of days, listen to a few lectures on urban planning and the history of the city. Was able to go to a museum, kind of catch the sights, as it were. And then we ended up taking another highlight. We took a high-speed rail train to Beijing, and that's where we ended our trip.
Can you, as an American, one of the things that I discuss with our American friends is everyone's like, oh, well, we don't need that. We have the interstate system. We have the most advanced interstate system in the world. That's why we don't need high-speed rail. But, as an American, what was your impression of China's high-speed experience?
Yeah, it was great. As an American, wish that we had the same kind of infrastructure in place. It was wonderful. It was really it took about 6.5, 7 hours to get from Chongqing to Beijing. We were lucky enough to actually have someone from the railway department, the transportation department, give us a brief lecture on the train, about the train, and the incredible system there. Yeah, it was very impressive. I think, personally, as an individual, it would be so nice to have the conditions of possibility for high-speed train travel instead of, as you put it, automobile travel and airplane travel being the dominant modes of mobility. So yeah, that really stood out as something that was exciting and
Yeah, 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in China since 2008 when they had zero. And now China has more than anywhere in the world. It's really convenient. I gave up driving before I moved to the Bay Area where we met. And I gave my car. I was like, I gave my keys to my brother. I said, I don't even want money. You just take this thing. I want nothing to do with it. And so I've always been kind of a personally like a fan of being able to get around by Amtrak or whatever means that we have in the United States, and BART as far as I can go, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. But now it's like I can go anywhere. I have complete freedom to travel throughout any of the cities in China, like really easily. Recently, I'm in Beijing, is where we met and spoke recently. I wanted to go to Tianjin, and I was like, I could go to Tianjin tomorrow, which is like another major city, like 20 million people. It's on the coast. It's not that far from Beijing. It's, I don't know, maybe 100 kilometers or less. So I just like went to the train station, no ticket, and I just like, can I get a ticket right now? And they're like, yeah, here, boom. 30 minutes later, I'm zooming towards Tianjin. And then I was like, okay, I guess I should go back now after a few hours. I was like, okay, I went in. Can I get a ticket back to Beijing? And they're like, yeah, you can get on. There's a train in like 45 minutes. Boom. And it's just amazing. I mean, gosh, I wish Americans knew how convenient it felt, because, it's nice to have a car. I get around. I use Didi, which is like China's answer to Uber. And it's very convenient. It's very nice. And that we have wonderful subway systems, but, just being able to hop on a train and go to another city on a whim really fast, conveniently, 350 kilometers per hour. Some of them are only 250 kilometers per hour. There's ones that are coming more than 500 kilometers per hour. There's some rail between Beijing and Shanghai that's being developed ultra fast. So it's just really exciting. And, so I want to get your impressions of Wuhan, because I love Wuhan. I lived there for a year. What did you think about how many days were you there, and what did you think about that city?
Yeah, we were there for a couple of days. Incredible, vast, huge, huge city. Obviously, it was great to land in Wuhan. It was a good city to sort of also, introduce ourselves to the landscape, and then also kind of try to get our footing. Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful city. Impressions, overwhelming in scope initially. I think maybe a part of it was of the long travel and sort of trying to readjust. And then also we were traveling mainly by bus. So, you'd mentioned the high-speed rail. Also a lot of highways in China, a lot of cars too.
Sure.
So we were stuck in traffic and sort of getting a view of the city from the road, and that was so impressive. Yeah, I liked Wuhan. I'd like to be able to spend a bit more time there. We did get to spend a little bit of time down by the river at some of the new parks. By the river, got a view of the waterfront.
It's my favorite place. So you went there at night. When we were speaking, when you were in Beijing, you mentioned going to the river, to the Yangtze River at night in Wuhan. What did you see? What was your impression? What was it like?
Well, I mean, great question. Saw a lot. I think, the thing that impressed me the most were the amount of people just using the space. That was impressive. That was a really neat thing to sort of be in. Collective space, a lot of families, a lot of older folks, young folks, just sort of hanging out, enjoying the space. I think the other thing that really strikes me was, because we were there at night and we saw the sort of skyline lit up, all of the buildings sort of in a very curated way lit up with lights, which was striking, right? Sort of the city as kind of whole, right? Like a literal sort of spectacle from afar was something that I wasn't expecting and didn't expect to see. And notice that was the theme, really. All city skylines, there seems to be a way to coordinate them as if they were a canvas and a single painter had the stroke on them. So that was impressive and very beautiful, of course. Interesting.
That was the first time I saw it was in Wuhan, but it's there. It's in Changsha. It's in Shenzhen. I think Shenzhen has the most spectacular spectacle of these kind of, using the buildings as a light show. And one of the things that China did, okay, so there's a couple of things here. Obviously, using all of that electricity is that an environmental issue? But also China is growing green energy faster than any country in the world. But another thing that is really interesting in terms of is it greener than not using it is that instead of fireworks in a lot of cities, so that there is not, all of the smoke that's associated with fireworks during Chinese New Year and other celebrations, they're using the buildings instead. So the
Yeah.
buildings become the fireworks, and they do like amazing, spectacular light shows during Chinese New Year's in some city centers instead of letting people just set off fireworks from every corner, like they have
This
done in the
this is a
past.
question I have that maybe you could ask for me, because one thing that struck me was the coordination.
Mhm.
Why you would not see a similar um, spectacle light show in the U.S., for example, because all of those buildings are owned by different people with different ideas about what should happen or not, and so there isn't sort of a central decision maker to decide what the landscape will look like from afar in the context of the U.S. city. As far as I know, who knows? Maybe Las Vegas. Maybe other cities have that sort of as a planning rubric or something. But that was striking to me, that it was very coordinated. That there were distinct, sort of obvious decision makers about what kind of light display would be on
I
this
think on
building.
maybe a different people may or different contributors may put on different light shows on different nights and different things, because sometimes you've seen like
Mm,
birds flying across multiple buildings, so it's
yeah.
things like that. So I'm not really sure how they plan that or anything like that. But
So
what's
the
really
planning part was
amazing,
so interesting to me.
mm,
That's what struck me the most about the whole thing was, this required planning. This required
a great
coordination.
deal, I'm sure.
And in fact, I mean, even going back to the discussion of high-speed rail, like massive amount of planning and
Mm.
a particular kind of decision-making structure that enables that kind of investment to happen, right? That's what really struck me about both of those things.
Well, what I just want to say before we move on,
Yeah.
that what I really like about Wuhan in that light show
Yeah.
is that it's on the river. So you're
Yeah.
not just seeing it on the buildings themselves, you're seeing it like in double because it's
Yeah.
reflected on the river. The river itself becomes like another part of the canvas, and it's just I've seen it in a lot of other cities, and it is spectacular. But
Yeah.
I don't think Wuhan can be beat because it has
Ah,
that double like kind of reflection thing going on. It's just
yeah. It's so cool.
one of my favorite cities in China. I
Can
mean,
I ask? Can
Chongqing
I?
is spectacular. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. Can I ask you? Yeah. I just want to know more about what you really appreciate about Wuhan. That's what I'm interested in.
Oh, well, I mean, I have so many different things. I've shared on the show a lot, so I'm going to, but I'll be happy to share again. There is in the old part of Hangzhou, which is like the formerly colonized part of Wuhan, there are all of these European buildings. But then, obviously colonialism has ended. And so you have all of these European buildings, German buildings, French buildings, and they become museums in some cases like shopping malls. But they're also inundated with ancient Chinese buildings. So you have like Taoist temples and Buddhist temples and just ancient Chinese architecture everywhere. And then you have all of this like hyper modernism from the 1980s, 1990s,
Mm.
and 2000, and then recently. And so you just have this mixture of all of this architecture from all over the world, all just kind of doing its thing together. And it's just stunning. Now, a lot of people like a different district. There's a lot of different districts in Wuhan, but I
Mm.
love Hangzhou because you have colonialism and modernism and postmodern architecture all just kind of jumbled together. And it's just every time you turn a corner, you don't know what you're going to see. And that's really beautiful. And you have Chinese street snacks. You turn a corner, there's like Western cafes with like cappuccino machines that have come from Italy and stuff. And so you can have like, in
Mm.
fact, the best cappuccino I've ever had in China, I had it in Wuhan. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the name of the place on the show. I'm going to say it anyway. It's called Passing by Cafe. It's just I'm an influencer. Sometimes I make videos for TikTok, and I had the cappuccino in front of me, and I was prepared in my head to just say this cappuccino is fantastic, right? That was what I was going to say before I even tried it. And then I tried it, and then I was just like, oh my God, this actually really is like an amazing. I didn't even know they could be this good. Like San Francisco, I've not had a cappuccino this good. So I was actually just like blown away. It wasn't, like sometimes you're confused as a consumer of coffee from these corporate mega giants. So you're like, what's the difference between a cappuccino and a latte? More milk, but that doesn't really seem like there's much difference. But this cappuccino made me realize what a cappuccino is supposed to be, because it wasn't milky. It was completely frothy all the way through. It was really, really nice. But then, people there are really kind, and they also have some different laws there where you can move your hukou. Hukou is how people move around. If you have a hukou in one area, that's where your kids are supposed to go to school and stuff. Increasingly, people can move around more and more and more and migrate from different cities. But Wuhan has a policy that if you have a bachelor's degree, you can automatically move your hukou to Wuhan. And Wuhan is filled with universities. For example, Wuhan University is one of the most prestigious universities in China, and it's just spectacularly beautiful. It's supposed to be the most beautiful university campus because of the flowers. I've not actually been on the campus, but I hear that it's spectacular for the cherry blossoms about this time of the year. But all those students, they move from the countryside into Wuhan to go to school and stay. So what you have is this very highly educated, very young population of people in their 20s and 30s just moving and shaking. So Wuhan has just got this youthful, intellectual vibrance, and you can feel it, if you spend some. I really, really like that city.
Yeah. That makes sense to me just from the brief sort of impression that I got from it. Very young. A lot of energy. Didn't get the cappuccino. Wish I had known about this place before, but nonetheless, really amazing place. So that was a highlight. That was a wonderful. I could spend I could spend years there probably, and not discover everything about it. But I did get a day or two, so that was good. Yeah.
I've spent more than 10 years in Beijing. I still feel like I barely scratched the surface of what's available here. A city of 20 million people, that's like, 3 Malaysias or something, the population. So there's just so much going on. There's so many places to go, so many museums, so many cultural events. It's, you could spend every day, all day going out constantly from morning to night, month after month, and just feel like, you're missing out. You get that FOMO from doing everything and still missing things because there's just too much to go and see. So it's in these mega cities, and there's just one after another in China. You have Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Chongqing, Beijing, Qingdao. It's just on and on and on. It's just there's so many mega cities. It's a completely different kind of urban experience than we have in the U.S. San Francisco, where we spent time together. What is the population, like 800,000? And we consider that a really big city for Northern California. It's like the big city in Northern California. But, a city of 800,000 people in China is considered like a town. Yeah. It's kind of bizarre. Yeah. Well, you studied cultural geography. What do you make of that? What was your impression after going to Chongqing, for example?
Yeah, it's so impressive. And you're right. I think the thing that obviously stands out is size, right? Size, both in Chongqing, it seemed horizontally very big, right? It's a municipality, so the area it's a big area, but also the density was really impressive. I think one of the things that really did strike me, and it almost is potentially banal observation at this point, but just the sheer amount of space and new building in particular, that we encountered was remarkable. Lots of new construction, lots of sky rises, lots of apartment buildings, and all relatively seemingly recent. So that was impressive, I have to say. Just the sheer amount of space, right, in these cities was amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah, what's really interesting about cities like Chongqing or Beijing is you can look at a map, even after as long as I've been here, and think, oh, okay, that's not that far. Yeah. But then it's a lot far. It's always a lot further than you anticipate. It's just like the map your brain doesn't seem to understand, like, okay, this little tiny space is going to be like, that's 2 hours of walking or something.
Right. So, right.
Yeah. I speaking of space, I want to share a story. I interviewed a young lady about 3 months ago, and she lives in a city called Shenyang. It's not that big. I think it's 10 million people or so, north of Beijing, kind of much colder, closer to Russia. And she mentioned having been there 10 years ago, and she thought, what is this place? All it is construction. The whole city, to her, when she arrived 10 years ago, just looked like one gigantic construction pit, for 10 kilometers in that direction and 10 kilometers in that direction. And now, in 2024, the construction is largely done, and so it just looks like this brand new city that just came out of like nowhere. And so
Mm,
her impression is just like she has a difficult time processing how fast China's speed really is.
yeah.
China grew for decades and decades at 10%, 9%, 8% GDP year after year, just booming amounts of money, and so much investment went into infrastructure so quickly, like no other modern nation in contemporary history, really. So it's
Yeah,
just
that was
it's a
so impressive.
bizarre kind of,
I mean, it
yeah.
was so interesting. Even, one thing that also sticks with me around that theme was on the train from Chongqing to Beijing. High speed rail, really wonderful. Going through the country, right? Going through these rural areas, and then all of a sudden, a stop. We'd be approaching a stop, and this booming city would be emerging out of seemingly the rural sort of hinterlands, and booming, humongous cities that I'd never heard of, right? So yeah, that was striking. Clearly, and I think, clearly that the decisions about how to coordinate development of cities and infrastructure like train stops and things like that would go hand in hand, right? And so that was interesting to see in a relatively recent time frame, past couple of decades, complete and utter transformation. I guess, modernity, modernization, these kinds of things. So it was
Well,
fascinating.
you mentioned crayfish, and you went to some kind of
Yeah.
crayfish farm and a local city near that crayfish farm that was somehow interlinked to the
Yeah.
the growth of crayfish. Could you share a little bit about that experience?
Oh, it was so interesting. Yeah. Have you ever been to Chongqing
I
district?
have not. No,
Oh, it was
no.
so interesting. Yeah. So this trip was organized as a class, like I said, and one of the first stops after Wuhan, after sort of experiencing this, vibrant, big, energetic city, was getting on a bus and going, a few hours um, down the river, pretty much, and spending a couple of days looking at different models of balancing, commodity crop production, the crayfish, with food security production, rice, right? And so thinking about the kind of 90% dedicated to rice production and 10% dedicated to crayfish production. And we looked at a state-owned farm, we looked at a village cooperative farm, we looked at a private farm, that were all sort of engaged in this practice, in this kind of production. And we also stayed in what I can only imagine, it seems like a relatively recent, relatively new town, city, kind of the lobster city, I suppose, really premised on the crayfish, right? And
Mm,
so
mm.
it seemed like this was a kind of whole development package premised around tourism and crayfish production and things like that. And so it was really interesting to see this taking off. I mean, someone described it that we were with almost like a sort of mini Las Vegas dedicated to the crayfish as its sort of brand or something. And that struck me as right. And we got to see both that part of it, the building of this town, massive construction, of course, in place, but then also these different models of agricultural production. The village co-op was really interesting. The state-owned farm was very interesting. The private farm was interesting. So yeah, that was a real highlight, something unexpected to me. I wouldn't have known about it or necessarily have encountered it if it hadn't been for Yuzhou, who organized the trip for us. And so it was a real great way. The crayfish in particular was a really great way for someone like me who was new to China to try to grapple with some of the larger questions around land ownership, land rights, the complexities around that, complexities balancing market integration and food security. So some of these big, broader, I think, dynamics was able to sort of have an object, literally this little crayfish, to think through with, which was really interesting. So, yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
it's
I'd recommend you
that's
go and check it out. I think you would like it a lot.
What did you learn about the cooperative nature of the farms there? Because I'm actually also interested, because there's a lot of co-ops still here in actually still being organized. A lot of people think that they're just like coming apart over time, but in fact, some cooperatives are being built over time. So what did you learn about this particular cooperative? How does it function? And I mean, even some superfluous details would be very insightful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all I got for you is superfluous details. But
Sure.
my impression was just I was very impressed by the kind of local village cooperative head. I think and his
Mm,
skills at
mm,
negotiating the tremendous
yeah.
amount, tremendous amount of different interests involved in building this cooperative, and also in negotiating with the corporation and the
Mhm.
sort of balancing of land rights versus management rights versus use rights and all of these things. So
Yeah.
it struck me as like, wow, this individual was very skilled as a sort
Yeah.
of social being, also as a political creature, in order to make this work. It did strike me as I guess this is a relatively new endeavor, right? The village is endeavoring to build this
Mhm.
cooperative and work with these corporations, and sort of brand its rice and all of these things. So it was really it was impressive. It was impressive, and
Mm,
also it struck me as ordinary, right? Like it took like
mm.
people putting in a lot of work to negotiate what this cooperative enterprise might look like. So I found that very impressive.
Part of the poverty alleviation campaign that is ongoing, had finished roughly, but is still ongoing as the Modern Prosperity Campaign, is about helping different markets uh, like connect rural and urban centers. So a
Yeah,
lot of the rural places that grow, just ordinary things like beets or almonds or whatever, have often not been able to be particularly profitable because their local market, there wasn't a huge price for whatever they were producing. So
right.
part of the 5G infrastructure that was created and part of the logistics infrastructure, building roads and rail across China, part of the poverty alleviation campaign was to connect these cooperatives that are increasingly being put together by various governmental and non-governmental organizations like the ICCIC, is helping them connect with markets that are further away so they can
Yeah,
get better prices for their produce. And in fact, people are encouraged in China to like buy from the hinterlands, to buy products
yeah,
from the least developed parts of the country to help their economies. One thing that is really cool, and we have sister cities in different countries, like, oh, this city in China is connected to this city in Detroit or whatever. But they in China, they actually connect really extremely wealthy cities with extremely poor provinces of China,
mm,
and then they're like become sister like cities or sister regions. And so the more wealthy place, they like, okay, well, I'm the mayor or whatever, I will help send some doctors or some teachers or some technical advisors, scientists, and so forth to help develop this place that is now kind of sort of pseudo under my supervision. And so it's just this amazing network that China is producing all over across itself. You mentioned the amount of planning. I think that's one of China's really good advantages. The leadership here are extremely good at planning, and so you see like the rapid growth due to all of this planning. I want to ask a different question though. What do you hope? Because you also mentioned when we met in Beijing that this might be something that happens again and again. That school trips might be coming back in the future. So I think that would
yeah,
be amazing. What do you or your colleagues hope that students are gaining from their
yeah.
experience coming to China?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think on a fundamental level, it's an opportunity to um, break through perhaps some of the, I don't know, mediations about China, the ways in which China is presented in the U.S. Is often somewhat hostile, not very nuanced, um, potentially, right? I don't want to say that as a blanket. Every all media is like that, but nonetheless, I think there is a sense that it's really good and helpful to be able to go to places and see them on the ground and talk to people and connect and think about living on the earth together with different people. And I think
Mhm.
that's a really valuable, I think generally a valuable exercise, right? Like, um, so at the broadest level, I think that's useful. I think also in particular, China is interesting because it does present a different model, right? A different model in a lot of different ways. That's complicated,
Mhm. Mhm.
and in fact, really really complicated and not easily abstracted and taken out of context and all of that stuff. And things are done differently, and China's figuring things out, right? Like in impressive ways, and so I think it's worth seeing for students and for myself, quite frankly, worth trying to get a sense of on the ground what that looks like, what that means. And then also just, it's nice to talk to human beings in different parts of the
Mhm.
world. I think
Yeah.
at root, that's the educational advantage that I can see. So yeah, and I think the hope is to continue to have these kinds of exchanges. And one of the ideas, and I think it would be really great, is to have students and faculty from Chinese universities and colleges come to the U.S. as well, right, and build that kind of exchange. Um, yeah, on the academic front, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm a massive proponent of people to people exchanges, and the advantage of students coming as opposed to adults is that students have, frankly, a lot longer to live, and they're going to probably have more opportunities to impact, culture for a longer period of time. So it's great if some, retiree in America is finally able to come to China. But if we can have students coming, they're probably going to be able to have a lot more impact on Sino-US relations moving forward, ensuring that there's more understanding between people and so forth,
So
which is
Jason, on
yeah,
that level,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
have a question for you, because one of the things
Sure.
I've been grappling with, I think, about that is knowing that there is a sort of benefit and a really um, important benefit to getting to know places and different people, and sort of the idea of the trip as being ultimately rooted in that notion, right? It's helpful to sort of break through stereotypes and biased media coverages and all of that stuff. And it also strikes me as true that um, the vast majority of people in both the US and in China, let alone the rest of the world, will be able to physically go on trips like the one that I went on. So I'm curious what you think in terms of how to, oh, I'll say it, bridge the divide, as it were, between places, so to sort of develop connections, to have conversations across, those cultural and geographic lines. How is there a way that we can think about doing that that doesn't require, massive travel plans and expenses for more
Well,
people?
absolutely. Sure. I think there are apps, if we're going to talk
Mm.
about the digital age, right,
Yeah.
that people do go online and they do
Hmm.
meet each other. And I've actually watched a lot of these videos on Instagram and X and other platforms where people post videos of each other surprising one another with things they might not expect to learn about each other. There's this famous Uyghur gentleman who, he looks Western, he looks Caucasian. So he likes to pop, and his English is impeccable. So he pops up on these platforms and he starts talking to people, and pretty soon he's like, yeah, I'm Chinese. And people are like, no, you're not. And so it's a great opportunity for people to realize that China is not just a bunch of Han people, that in fact, China has 56 uh, ethnic groups. 55 of those are minority groups. And so learning about that, I think, is a really interesting surprise for a lot of people who do see China with like a blanket vision from like Hollywood and movies about Bruce Lee and stuff. And their impression of China is honestly, for most people don't dislike China or like China. Most people don't know anything about China.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is there, like Chinese food and kung fu movies and maybe a couple of other stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that there is no supplement for like going to a place, especially when it's very clear to me personally that politicians in our country, and not just our country, but a lot of the G7 countries, have been portraying what's going on in China, and they're misrepresenting what life in China is like. So I think, due to the fact that the wealthy control media and politicians in our countries. Like, it's very kind of important for people to come here and kind of see China for itself and realize that there's way more to what's going on than like, oh my gosh, there was a boat incident in the South China Sea. Oh, we should all be scared. No,
Yeah.
actually, like, people in China and people in the US are very similar, actually. People, there's somewhere in America in the afternoon, a grandpa is holding his grandson hand and they're walking to school. And in China, the next evening, it's afternoon in China, and there's a grandmother holding her granddaughter's hand and walking to school. I mean, it's pretty much the same. Families who want a better life for their kids, for their families, for their grandparents, for their parents, for their communities in both the US and China. And there's a spectacular difference in culture, obviously, right? Culture, like dance styles, music, dress, how one behaves at functions, and so forth. But at the base of everything, people in the United States, my own family, are not that dissimilar from the families that I've met here in China.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, obviously there are all these things that pop out that are different, like, but there's so much that we have that's just common. I mean, globally, we're all just one human family. So I really would like to see more people come to China. And it's never been easier than right now. I just want to mention a couple of things since you asked this question. If you are from the EU right now, you don't even need a visa to come to China. You can just pop on a plane and fly to China, because China has been easing visa restrictions. In order to get a tourist visa to come to China from the United States, previously you needed to book your flight ahead of time and book your hotels ahead of time, then apply for the visa, which is a really, maybe cart before the horse kind of way of doing things. And so China has changed that. Now you can just apply for the visa with no bookings whatsoever. So then after you get the visa, you would be able to book everything appropriately and go at the time that when your visa is functional. So China has been taking note that it wants more people to come and see it, to come and meet people here, to have these people-to-people exchanges, not just at the level of diplomacy, not just at the level of businesses, but the level of normal, everyday folk, just regular people who were like, oh, well, I want to travel. Maybe I want to travel to China. And so that has been made easier and easier and easier. There are some obstacles to that, because our own State Department on its own website is like warning Americans, oh no, it's very dangerous in China. Well, if you are in fact an agent of the US State Department who is coming here to spy, yeah, it might not be the safest place, but for everyone else who just wants to see the Great Wall and, try like local cuisine, it's perfectly safe in my opinion. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, it would be nice to see, digital platforms more active in facilitating other kinds of people-to-people exchange, in addition to coming and seeing China for oneself.
Yeah, I just don't know what that would look like. I think there's got to be other models than what I've seen right now. And I think you're right. There is something. I think it's a challenge, right? But there is something about being present in a place that you can't really replace. So
let's turn this on its head, because I haven't been in the United States very much in the last 10 years. I've only been there for maybe 2 weeks out of the last decade. But when I watch media, and I'm not talking about Chinese media, I'm talking about American media, it's like one school shooting after another, danger in the streets, people attacking each other, because that's what media is. Media is like, it wants to sell, it wants to make commercials, it wants you to watch. So it's very sensational. But like my experience of going to like my mom's hometown, Modesto, California, walking around, is it's just kind of boring. There's like birds and people are like shopping and stuff, and maybe fighting over a parking space in the Walmart.
That's right.
Like it's not all sensational and like scary. It's just an ordinary kind of place.
That's right.
And so, the same is true of China. It's not this sensational, crazy place. It just like people have outside of the United States, I've met a lot of people. That's one of the great things of living abroad. I get to
Yeah.
meet a lot of international citizens, and we talk about America, and people are like, in America, like everyone has a sports car. And I'm like, no, that's just Hollywood, right? So these misrepresentations, these distortions that media feed people from Instagram, right? Or from like Facebook and all, or just like the Hollywood movies, don't show what America is like. And the same is true of China. So if we really want to understand each other, I don't think that there's any shortcut. I really think people just need to pop on a plane. Yeah, is that environmentally the most responsible way to behave? No, but maybe go to Asia one year, go to Europe the next year. At least you have a better perspective on like what the world is like than just staying home in your hometown.
Yeah. Yeah. A great set of points. Couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that got raised by, I think, some of the students on the trip, that struck me as also telling, was a sense actually of after we arrived there and we spent a couple of days in China and we were moving around the country a little bit, a sense of the ordinary emerged, and that was interesting. Right, this is an ordinary people, looking to live good life, being curious about certain things, kind of getting off of work and wanting to get home. And I think there's a connection in the everyday in that way between people, probably. So very interesting.
You're also traveling in a giant pack of what we call Lawai, right? A bunch of foreigners all together, and you're going to some smaller towns and cities, right? So
Yeah,
what were your
yeah,
interactions with locals standing out as this tall foreigner guy with
yeah,
blue eyes, no eyes?
yeah. We've talked a lot of the class and faculty and stuff. I've talked quite a bit about that. It's sort of to be expected, right? We're tourists traveling around. So yes, that was there. I didn't get a sense, to be quite honest, that it was, it was like obvious that we were traveling in a group, but nothing outrageous. If anything, it was like, oh yeah, like let's, it was kind of interesting to see people want to take pictures of us, and instead of vice versa, right? Speaking of the sort of colonial history and the sort of tourist gaze and all of that, so that was somewhat reversed in certain circumstances, which was interesting. But for the most part, people, it was everyone was quite welcoming and kind and nice and all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, that obviously brings other challenges when you're traveling with a group of people that have nothing necessarily to do with the place that you're in. But it was great. I think it was a good experience in that way. And we went to different places. Everyone couldn't have been more kind and welcoming, from Central China Normal University to a tea plantation in the sort of hinterlands. Like everyone was really, really welcoming. Yeah, so it was great. Yeah, I mean that was my impression anyway.
Well, could you tell us about the tea plantation? I've actually been to a tea plantation as well. I went in Jiangxi. I
Mm,
went to a tea plantation there, but we had missed the harvest season, so everything had just been harvested, and there were no farmers around.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a quick flyby of that part, but outside of Anxi, am I pronouncing that correctly, Jason?
I don't know where Anchi is. I know
Okay.
some people named Anchi, but when the tones change, everything's changes in
Yeah, there you
China.
go. There you go. Yeah, I mean, um, towards the Grand Canyon sort of tourist site, outside of Yichang, there, kind of relatively close to the dam. Anyway, yeah, it was small villages that looked to me like a part of this, undergoing this process. It sounds like you're familiar with, where there's been an increased effort to address rural poverty. And it
Mhm.
seems to me that a part of the way in which that has unfolded is an emphasis on tourism, particularly, I'm guessing, domestic
Yeah.
tourism.
Mhm.
So that was a part of how we encountered these tea farms and stuff. And that was remarkable, right? Clearly, the big distinction that stood out to me was in inequality or income or whatever, had to do more with the urban-rural distinction than within cities necessarily, although I'm sure that's also there. And so it was interesting to go in these rural areas and see, efforts to raise standards of living, to bring in tourism dollars, to work on infrastructure, highways, things like that. So that was another interesting aspect of the trip. And some of the smaller, just beautiful places, And speaking of ordinary, everyone, it was cool to see largely older people in the rural areas, kind of going about life, right? That I think we might have talked a little bit about that as something that I was interested was seeing the generational differences between the rural and urban, and how that maybe was something being grappled with or thought about, or addressed in some ways. How to take care of the old people, right? Like one of the great things that seems to me about the cities, and we've talked about this incredible city building, modernization, all of these things happening in China. Lots of young people, lots of enthusiasm, lots of energy in cities. What do you do with the old folks in the country? Right? Like, what about them, right? And that strikes me as something that we were witnessing efforts to address in small ways, which seems reasonable, right? Let's care about what happens to the people in the countryside, as well as the opportunities in the city.
It's so interesting. Your observations are so like in lockstep with like how the data kind of spells things out. So it's really interesting that you have all these impressions, because there are cliches in Chinese culture that the young people move to the cities and then send resources back to their parents who stay in the countryside. I kind of want to share a personal experience. I'm married to a lovely Chinese lady, and her grandmother, who's quite old, about 80, she lives in the deep countryside, and we have repeatedly, like said, "Hey, grandma, come live with us." And the answer is, "This is my home.
Yeah.
I don't want to come live with you in Beijing. I want to live here in my, so she's like living alone in the countryside, and the government has made all these efforts to like make medical care available. So doctors might come visit her if she needs something. And they've actually rolled out, she didn't used to. In 2014, she didn't have plumbing. But in 2014, China announced they're going to make plumbing available just for everyone, no matter what. And they're going to just make it happen in every province in China. So she had a well in front of her house that she actually used to pump. 2015, I go visit. She has plumbing. She has a running water and a flushing toilet. Wow. And so like, she's just like, I'm not leaving. So it's really bizarre. So we actually have to like send her things to make her life more comfortable there, because she refuses to move in with us, even though we have a spare bedroom here that she could live in. And so it's really bizarre. The government, Chinese government, has spent a lot of effort trying to move some of the rural residents into urban areas, but some people are just like, no. And so that creates this complication. And so you mentioned roads. That's also a thing. There's a Chinese phrase: if you want to become rich, build a road. And so one of the things that China has endeavored to do over the last couple of decades, or maybe even, forever, is build roads to all of these different places. So if there's an impoverished community, try to make it accessible to the major cities. So not just people can leave or whatever, but they can have access to the market, so they can sell goods. And so all of these things are, and you're right, there is an aging population here in China. And so, yeah, this is an ongoing dialogue that is being worked through about how to provide care for people who are like, no, this is where I live. So if you're going to provide care for me, it's going to be here. And so, yeah, it's easier to provide care for your, infirmed grandfather or grandmother if they live in the major city that you're residing in. And I know people who are taking care of their grandparents here in Beijing, but when they live, 1,000 kilometers away, it's much more complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, I wanted to ask you, right now in America, one of the big things that is people at least say there is a housing shortage, right? And this is something I think about a lot. Is this because people are buying it up so they can create more renters, and then renters can't buy homes because the home costs are so expensive because people bought them up to rent them out? Or, this is space and human geography. In China, we have these super mega towers. Some of them are like, 50 stories tall, filled with like there's a town called Oakdale in California. I think the population is 20,000. There are a couple communities here in Beijing where it's just a fenced off couple buildings. That's the entire population of Oakdale could just fit there. So like, is there an opportunity to build different kinds of infrastructure, or what's going on in the housing community in your opinion in the United States? Are there things that can be borrowed?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously it depends on where you're at, right? Like geography, place matters in terms of what the housing situation looks like. I think, generally there's a sense, the standard, I think, understanding of the crisis is that it is one of shortage. Of course, I think, it is also agreed upon by most thinking folks that the problem is affordable housing, not just space, but housing relations. And I think that's something that's really important to take note of. It depends, right? Like some places, for sure, there hasn't been investment in affordable housing for people. In other places, there's been a lot of investment in housing, but primarily to store capital. So, whether it's being actually used as housing or not is almost secondary to its purpose, right? So the combination of financialization, commodity housing, has led to a real dearth of quality housing for a lot of people. And so, it's a fundamental problem, housing in the US, a fundamental one that grassroots organizations, housing activists have been, certainly at the front line. Tenant organizations, tenant unions have been at the front lines of trying to address in ways that actually address the problem, which isn't simply one of space, but of a particular kind of housing relationship, right? Which is premised on the commodity form, which is premised on housing to make a lot of money, speculative housing. So to my mind, that's the key sort of kernel, the key problem to address. Certainly, I think, we can imagine, the amount of investment for public infrastructure, for housing in China would be a welcome, a welcome exercise in welcome project in the United States. We need more social housing. We need more public housing. And so, yeah, I think, of course, that'd be great. Of course, then what happens is politics, as you know, right? Housing is, all politics is local. This is true everywhere, I think, but especially in the U.S., that's tied to housing politics. So, and that looks different depending on where you're at, right?
Yeah.
So the federal government in the U.S., for example, has spent the past 20 years tearing down more public housing than building it, sort of replacing it with voucher systems and things like that. So, there's a lot to contend with. I do think that right now, and especially since the crisis of 2008 to 2010, the foreclosure crisis, we're seeing, COVID, of course. We've seen this burgeoning of the tenants movement, of the housing rights movement, that if there is any sort of solution or solid attempt to provide affordable housing going forward, it will be born out of those movements. To my mind, it will be born out of the models of decommodified housing, social housing that are erected from the ground up. So that's I think China is obviously a very different case, but an interesting one for someone from the United States who for their entire life has been dealing with something called the crisis, or crisis after crisis after crisis. China presents an interesting alternative way to think about how dwelling might be provided, for sure. Granted, very different contexts, right? Different cultures, different political cultures. And so, but that was certainly something that I was interested in while I was in China, thinking about the differences. The in-your-face level of housing precarity in the United States, the way in which the sheer desperation and the amount of unhoused people literally left out of housing is remarkable. And driving through Wuhan, not sort of being confronted with the scenes of unhoused people was striking to me, for example. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. On the other hand, I will say, goodness gracious, it does seem like China's building a lot of space. And I'm not so, it strikes me as a lot of building, and a lot of spaces of spectacle, grand hotels, lots of buildings. That also seems like it might pose some challenges going forward. But that was just a sense that I had.
That's interesting. We're almost out of time. I just want to mention that despite the fact that there may actually be too much housing in China, right, which is a problem that the economy in China is dealing with, that Hilton is actually building 731 new hotels in China.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm sure they're luxury
complex.
and yeah.
Last question. As a researcher of we're almost out of time, so we're going to have to keep this answer as short. As a researcher of space, I'll give you a minute or two before I cut you off brutally. As a researcher of space and human geography, if you could spend more time in China and study, what would you be most interested in learning about, studying?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, so many answers. So you might have to cut me off, right? Because I might start snowballing here. I actually would like to spend a little bit more time with the crayfish. I think that would be an interesting sort of end to thinking about questions of space, land ownership, different models of ownership, how markets and collective ownership are being integrated in particular ways, what that looks like. Just a sort of a general interest. But then, I was so fascinated with Chongqing and this notion of Chongqing as a kind of inland port city, right? To me, as an urban geographer, human geographer, I'm very interested in that idea. And that city seems so interesting from a planner geographer's perspective. So I'd be interested to think and look more into that. Among other things, of course, right? Like, I think for me also, I'm very interested in Chinese politics. That's something that we didn't get a very good chance to learn about or talk too much about in the class. But that strikes me as really interesting and something that I would like to know more about and try to have a sense of given this place, given the capacity of planning, given the poverty alleviation programs and the really remarkable sort of recent history in China, I think it would be. I'm curious, right, to know more about Chinese politics around planning and those sorts of things. So all of that in a nutshell. I mean, and I guess maybe one way to sort of sum it up is what this trip offered me was a sense of how much I don't know. Right. And that's a good starting place to realize.
Yeah, that's always.
My goodness, there's a lot to know and a lot to explore. So
after 10 years here, I feel the exact same way now. So, I mean, it's always a good place to start when you start thinking about, I'm just a guest here in China. I'm a guest in their house. So, no matter how much time I spent here, after having been raised in the United States, there's always going to be more to learn. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. John Elric. Maybe we can.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. It's such a pleasure to see you, and it's always insightful to get to talk to you and hear your thoughts about things. So thanks so much for having me.
Likewise.